When you were growing up, you probably learned one of the most basic moral principles that there is. You ought to treat other people as individuals for who they are, not on the basis of how they look or who their parents are, what their parents did. You ought to judge people for what they do and what they say, for the choices they make. That was a good principle. We haven't always followed it as individuals or as a country, but we ought to try to follow it as best we can, our hardest, because bigotry diminishes and hurts people. It's pretty simple. And yet somehow, over time, the institutional left has decided to reject that idea and embrace a standard that is both new and time-worn. You may have assumed that race guilt, collective punishment, moral purity based on bloodline, you thought those were discredited ideas, creepy relics of a darker time. It turns out they're not. And yet, remarkably, these very same people are the quickest to cry racism at the slightest provocation or for no reason at all. They think of themselves as arch enemies of racism. They get tattoos on their arm telling you that, and yet they're its chief purveyors. Deep, deep irony. How do they do that? Well, simple. They redefine the term. As Vice.com succinctly put it a couple of years ago, quote, "It is literally impossible to be racist to a white person." Pretty much the entire left now takes that as a matter of faith. They deeply believe that. But what does that mean exactly? Is there really an entire race of people so repulsive, so morally repugnant that it is, quote, literally impossible to wrong them? You could do anything to people like that and not feel bad about it. In fact, why wouldn't you? They deserve it. They're not really human. That's the attitude. It's not hard to guess where ideas like that wind up. We've seen it. All of us should be afraid of it. All of us, regardless of color. There are plenty of examples in history of what happens when people start thinking this way. And they're all sad. It's awful. And yet this is the mindset the left has imposed on our country. It's an attitude designed to dehumanize the individual, to erase what makes each of us interesting and distinct and vital, and reduce us to faceless members of a group. It's totalitarian. We ought to resist it with everything that we have.